Okay, I think I'm gonna let in everyone and just ask them for 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. We should be starting shortly, but I crave your indulgence for another 5 minutes or so before we begin. Okay, thanks for your patience. Think we can get started. Slide you're on now, yeah. Okay, everybody is hearing me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. So let us begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar entitled Unlocking Opportunity, Building a Robust Micro-Credentials Framework. My name is June Wheatley Holness, one of 3 CANQATE regional coordinators, and I'm also a quality assurance officer at UWI. And I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's important and timely webinar. This is the first one we're having for 2025. We hope to have at least one more. And really, we want to talk about micro-credentials. You see, in an era marked by rapid technological change, evolving workforce demands, and really a growing need for lifelong learning. Micro-credentials really has emerged as a flexible and innovative response, offering the opportunity to acquire targeted and practical skills. So today, we gather to explore how a robust and responsive micro-credentials framework can unlock new opportunities. Our presenter is very knowledgeable in this area, and so we look forward to what she has to share with us this evening. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. So one, please keep your microphones muted. Please feel free to use the chat feature to add, submit questions throughout the session. The webinar is being recorded. I should let you know. It's being streamed on YouTube. And so we really encourage you to reflect, to engage with us this evening. So with that, let's get started. So we will first have a welcome from our president of CANQATE, Mr. Curtis Floyd. Mr. Floyd, you may go ahead.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you, June, and welcome to everyone. As June would have indicated, it has been a while since we have met, and this is the first of the webinars that we'll be having for this year, 2025, as a forerunner to our upcoming CANQATE conference, which you will be hearing about very shortly. The topic this evening is one which is very, very topical and very relevant. We would have had a meeting some time ago in Jamaica where we had persons from all over the Caribbean meeting to discuss this whole experience of of micro-credentials. And we had representatives not only from the Caribbean, but from other parts of the world. This is an area which is garnering a lot of attention. We know that lots of institutions are moving in this direction. I am sure that, like ACTT, a lot of the other quality assurance agencies, I'm sure, would be approached and being asked about how are we going to be regulating micro-credentials, because there are lots of providers and institutions out there that are very much interested in this field. So we're really happy to be able to have all of you here this evening. I'm sure that the numbers will go up as the evening progresses. And I really want to thank our presenter today, Tennille, who was one of those who was in Jamaica on this whole thrust with exploring micro-credentials. So as usual, we would want to encourage you to be participative. Um, Make sure that you ask whatever questions that you have, make whatever comments that you have in this area so that we all can benefit and learn from each other. So without further ado, I know that we're already a couple minutes behind time, so I just want to hand back over to June and thank you all again for your interest and for your presence here this evening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Floyd. Well, as you know, you should know by now, CANQATE Conference 2025 will be held in Belize. I hope you have all registered, submitted your abstract, and you're planning to join us in Belize come November. And so I now invite Dr. Evan Palmer, who is the Director of Tertiary and Post-Secondary Education in the Ministry of Education, Belize, as well as she's a chair of the local organizing committee for CANQATE Conference 2025. Dr. Palmer, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, June. Truly appreciate the welcome. To get into it, I'll just share a PowerPoint presentation, if you don't mind. If you can give me access to share, please.
Yeah, sure, just a moment. Okay, you should be able to.
All right, so we move to the update of the conference. So key updates that we wanted to share.
We're still not seeing your PowerPoint. Well, at least I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing
You're not seeing it?
files. Yeah, I'm not seeing the PowerPoint.
All right, let me share again. You're seeing it? Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay.
You can put it in presentation mode.
Yes. Sorry, it's not going in.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay. Key updates that we wanted to share from the last presentation. The date has been changed from October 29th, 30th, and the 31st to November 12th and 13th. Pre-conference being the 11th of November. We were asked to change the date, and so we went ahead and changed the date. We figured part of the reason was because CXC was having their conference on those same dates that we had previously identified. And by then we had not published save the date nor call for papers. And so it made reasonable or sound decision to go ahead and make the change. So you will note that it's now November 12th and 13th for the actual dates of the conference, and pre-conference workshop will be the 11th of November. The tour moves to November 14th. And today marks the first deadline for submission of abstract. To date, we have 9 submissions, and the amount that we have received, we saw the importance of extending the time frame. And so the new date is now August 4th for submission of abstract. Deadline for approval of abstract has also moved to August the 25th. And deadline for submission of papers is October the 6th. And deadline for approval then goes to October the 27th. Next step, the publishing of the extended date for call for papers, ongoing finalization of agenda and speakers. From our marketing point of view, we had published on our Facebook from the Ministry of Education the marketing of the call for papers and the save the date flyer that was on our the Ministry of Education's Facebook page. And so those will be updated as well. And we will be doing additional campaign in terms of outreach, ongoing logistics, including the accommodation, transportation, and all of those things. Those continue. We would like some feedback on in terms of the proposed agenda and topics. We have not presented anything so far, but we would also need assistance with outreach effort to attract delegates. We're hoping that CANQATE will update the webpage soon enough so that we can have additional submissions of papers. We're thinking that the reason for the low submission is because the webpage for CANQATE has not been updated with any of the information with regards to the conference and the specified dates. Moving to the fees, we also moved the registration. In terms of early registration is now August the 18th. And that ends the 16th. That allows for the 10% discount. Registration continues all the way up to the date itself. But in terms of online registration, that is going to end the end of October. The rates remain the same because we didn't receive any changes from the Board of CANQATE with regards to the fees that we have proposed for the conference. If there are any changes, we would appreciate that feedback as soon as possible before we open the registration for participants and for delegates. We have some projected timeline as the last time. If you note the call for papers, it has been extended now to August the 4th in terms of abstract, no? The marketing, the same information from the last time that I have there. In terms of logistics, that is ongoing and it is on track. Materials, you will note the timeline that we have included there. The reason for that is based on the registration as well. We move based on the amount of people that we're getting as they move towards registering and ensuring that they have paid and all of those things. Any questions so far? That's the end of my presentation. I'll take questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Palmer.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, what we were hoping you'd tell us about is the the draft program. If you have like places where the conference will be held, what are the attractions like? You know, what the program will be like at this stage. So outside of the formal 2-day conference, like do you have a theme for the pre-conference workshop?
Oh, yes. Yes, we do.
What are the attractions? Outside what's the entertainment, things like that will
Okay. All right, sure.
pique people's interest to want to come.
All right. I guess because the initial presentation we had included those things and I didn't put it in this time. Sorry about that. All right. So the tour is still to the Mayan temple, which is the largest Mayan temple in the country, which is the Caracol, that is in the Cayo district, and that is an optional tour, which is the Friday, the 14th of November. So that is still set for that particular days. In terms of entertainment, we have one night, which is the final night, where we will have the marimba group. They will present. We will also have a Garifuna cultural group from one of the junior colleges in the country. They will be doing a rendition from the Garifuna culture. It's a combination of the various dances. That group is the winner of a competition in the country. And so they will be presenting that. We will also have steel pan from the University of Belize. They will be, that is going to happen on the night of the formal dinner. The formal dinner is going to be held at the government house, which is now a museum of Belize. One of the museums in Belize, actually, it's by the in front of the sea. And so that is going to be the area where that is going to be hosted right next to our House of Culture. And so it's a lovely place. Our next presentation, I'll have photographs so that people can have better insight, as we had shared with regards to the Caracol venue, the last presentation. The first night of the conference, which is the Wednesday, is the first night of the conference itself. The minister is going to host a cocktail for participants, and there are going to be some speeches and all of that to welcome the participants and all of that. In terms of the we have a visit planned for participants, which is going to be to the Museum of Belize. That one is part of your conference package. You don't need to pay extra for it. It's going to be the afternoon of the first day, which is the Thursday. Sorry, Wednesday.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Okay, so we'll have that, you'll share that information as
Yes.
as time goes by.
Right. And then I'll share as well the pre-conference, because we have the pre-conference which is planned for the 11th, which is the Tuesday of
Correct.
the conference. I'll have all the key information with regards to that. By then, we would have completed the information for the persons who are going to be presented. So far, we have one presenter for the pre-conference workshop, but we are going to be having two presenters. And so that should add to the excitement to coming to Belize. Thank you.
Correct. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
And we look forward to receiving the additional information.
Yes, and one more thing, Mrs. Weeksley, we would hope that the board or some members of the board would be would
Yeah, we
partake
will.
with the
The board will discuss
planning.
that but this is the webinar, so
Mhm.
this
Yes.
is not just the
Yes.
the board. It's a webinar that so we'll speak about that, and we'll
Thank you.
all right.
Yes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thanks for the information as well. So
Alright.
I'm sure we'll get excited as the information comes to us, and we will all be heading to Belize in November.
Thank you.
Right. So our presenter this evening is the dynamic Miss Tennille Panovich. But before she comes and takes the spotlight, we have the pleasure of introducing her. I know Ethan is supposed to be doing the introduction. I don't think he's on as yet. So I will go ahead and introduce Ms. Panovich for you. So, Tennille, Ms. Tennille Panovich currently serves as the program officer in the Office of Research in the School of Graduate Studies and Research at the University of the West Indies, where she has held various roles in academic administration for the past 17 years. Her areas of expertise include program administration, policy and regulatory development, research funding and promotion, and digital transformation. Since 2020, she has led projects to streamline the UWI's continuing and professional education framework and has served as a consultant in the design and development of online micro-credentials. She has also participated in regional and international discussions on common frameworks and credit transfer systems for micro-credentials. In addition to her administrative contributions, Ms. Panovich actively engages with the academic community through published research and on research output impact metrics in the Caribbean, and she has done numerous presentations at the regional and international conferences on micro-credentials. Ladies and gentlemen, help me to welcome Ms. Tennille Panovich to deliver the presentation to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the region. Thank you for that introduction. And just to say, I was Googling some of the names as I was waiting to come on to present to try to figure out who's in the room here today, to figure out who I'm talking to and how I should be pitching some of the information in the presentation. I promise you I'm not going to get too technical, but there is some information that we do need to go over in terms of micro-credential frameworks. And I'm going to share with you towards the end some thoughts on some observations I've made having participated in some of these conversations and some of these conferences and some of these technical meetings that have been going on for some time now. I have been going down this rabbit hole since about 2020. This is when my journey towards micro-credentials started. And it's been a very interesting journey. Now, I'm just trying to pull up my chat because I do want a little bit of audience participation to start. I've put up 2 pictures on the screen. I don't know if you all could make out what they are. I don't want to give away the answer too quickly or guide you towards that one answer or the other. But I've put up 2 images on the screen in terms of having this discussion around building a micro-credential framework for the Caribbean. And they're 2 representations of buildings at different stages. And to the audience, I just want to ask before I start my presentation in the main, which one of these images you believe more closely represents what this building of this micro-credential framework really means as we move forward. I'm going to just pull up the chat and see if I get any responses. Monitoring the chat. I'm hearing somebody's voice. If you want to throw a response in, open your mic and throw a response in, that's fine. But just to get a sense of what people think we are going to do. So is it the picture, the green one to the left side, or is it more the beigey color one to the right-hand side, the one on the right? All right, good. I got 1 response so far. Anybody else wants to take a stab at it? The one on the right. Beige. Anybody thinks it's the one on the left? You could throw that in. Right, there we go. Building. Yeah. So what I was trying to illustrate through these 2 images, one to the left is more of a clearing a pathway, almost starting from scratch and building. And the one to the right is more of a renovation type image, where there are existing foundations and structures, and what we are trying to do is make an adjustment to what exists. And in fact, as we go through and we try to answer, and thank you so much for all of your responses, as we go through and we try to respond to that question of what is this, what's all this fuss about? Dr. Floyd would have indicated earlier, there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of discussion all of a sudden around micro-credentials. Why all of a sudden are we hearing all this fuss? And I'm going to borrow from our colleagues across in UNESCO who put out a report, and they were able to identify a few things that are happening globally that is leading us towards trying to develop this framework or trying to develop these frameworks. It's starting to meet the needs of some underdeveloped disciplines or some underserved disciplines, I should say, underrepresented, excuse me. Even though this is something that has been growing at this point in time, excuse me, sorry, this was my first slide. Right, so what we have is we have changes in technology, we have evolving market labor market demands. We do have organizations who are approaching us, employers who are approaching us, traditional providers of education saying they need their persons upskilled, they need them reskilled, they need it done in a very short space of time. And then we can use these micro-credentials as an opportunity to address some of our skills gaps. And one that I find very interesting, and I'm going to just kind of splint it throughout the presentation this evening, is it's promoting educational equity and access. And I thought that it came up a couple times in my preparation for this research, this equity and access issue. And of course, as we know, there is this shift generally that's taking place from traditional long-range credentials. The demand is shrinking, and there's this increase now for shorter, more direct opportunities to do learning, acquiring skills, etc., and specifically to meet marketplace employers' needs. One of the things I do want to share now, back to that question I asked earlier, is the concept and the existence of micro-credentials is not new. In fact, for those of us who are operating in the education field, which most of us are here in this presentation this evening, this concept has existed for quite a while, and we've been doing it in different ways. One of the things I know at the UWI we can tap or match this back to is the concept of someone accessing the university through a registration called Specially Admitted, where they come into the university and they could read a single course, one single course out of a program, either the undergraduate level or the graduate level. And this is a micro-credential, and this has existed based on my research for at least 3 decades. So we've been doing it. And when you look at the global patterns, this is something that has existed for a while. So as we move to the next slide now, which I pulled up a little bit earlier, we'll see what the urgency is around us starting to move towards this framework for micro-credentials. So they've existed. Yes, it's more of a renovation than it is starting from scratch. But why is it we have this urgency now to address this framework? So again, they're gaining popularity, they're allowing access to underrepresented fields. We recognize that globally, within the last 3 to 4 years, most countries are now starting to put out, and I'll expand it a little bit later on, most countries are now starting to put out frameworks and regulations and quality assurance mechanisms around these micro-credentials, again, that have existed for a while now. Institutions are putting out frameworks, but there's a lack of coordination, there's a lack of harmonization, and that leads to some challenges that I would raise a little bit later down in the presentation. And there's a potential risk here that we are trying to address. There's a problem that we are trying to solve. And that problem is if we are starting to service a need, and this is more so the education institutions are trying to service this need that is coming out of the employment marketplace or out of the industry. We are getting this explosion. It's happening. It has been happening. It's continuing to happen. There's this explosion of this request for these micro-credentials, and we have a risk of pushing ahead. We don't have the proper quality assurance in place. We kind of mock it up before we even start. And that's why we're saying, listen, let's just take a look at what's happening now, and let's try to set this up. Let's try to align this. So just to let you know, in terms of the existing frameworks, there are quite a bit across the globe. These are just a few that I pulled up for this evening's presentation. You'd notice that guidelines have been starting to be established since as far back as 2020 in Malaysia. So we have the UK, Europe, Canada, Africa, Asia and Pacific, and New Zealand are some of the countries who've put out, Australia as well, are some of the countries who've put out micro-credential framework, standards, guidelines, etc. I would just say to the group here this evening, you see that online micro-credentials toolkit at 2024 that's put out by the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. You can Google all of this. I think it's a fantastic document. It's something that really puts a series of documents together and a series of frames together that allows you to start developing micro-credentials, but also think about the framework within which they're being developed. So in 2025, we are in good company, and a lot of groundwork has been done. We do not need, in developing our framework for the Caribbean, we do not need to start from scratch. There's a lot of information that's out there. There's a lot of research that has already been done. And it will be good for us to, of course, take a study of these things. For those who are responsible for developing this micro-credential framework for the Caribbean, to take a study of what has already been put out there as we develop our own frameworks here in the Caribbean. In terms of the regional projects and initiatives, so again, one of our earlier presenters referenced the Commonwealth of Learning's project. I'll start with UNESCO. UNESCO has been pulling together since last year a group in Latin America and the Caribbean. I was able to participate in this. It is very much Spanish-centric Latin America and the Caribbean. UWI was the only English-speaking institution, and Jamaica. There was a gentleman from Jamaica there as well that was represented here. So UNESCO has started that. There's some reports that are out. I'll reference them a little bit later on. There's some reports that they've put out. Again, persons are doing the work for us. We don't need to start from scratch. And they are looking at, of course, quality assurance and recognition across various borders. So this is UNESCO and the IESALC. Now, with the Commonwealth of Learning, this is what was referenced earlier. Some of us in the room have been participating in these consultations that are taking place with the Commonwealth of Learning. And I don't know if persons are trying to send me a chat. I'm seeing some chats come up. I'll check it momentarily. So the Commonwealth of Learning is looking at doing a Commonwealth-wide, so this is global, 56 member states. They are specifically targeting micro-credentials credit transfer framework. So how do we get the credits or the micro-credentials accepted in all the different territories of the Commonwealth? That's the work that's being done there. And UWI, the Caribbean, we are all participating. And of course, I would say here this evening, CANQATE has a role in making sure we facilitate the discussions and sharing best practice with the Caribbean regions to help us move towards a framework, a Caribbean framework. This is by no means meant for you to absorb. One of the things I wanted to put out here is coming out of the UNESCO conversations. While we were running through the presentations and the discussions and the consultations over the 2 days, there were 4 panels that were presented, and this was a series of questions that helped all of the participants kind of try to hone in and focus on what are the critical elements of a framework, what are some of the discussions we need to have, what are some of the items of that we need to figure out, what do we need to sort through, what do we need to think through. It was really interesting listening to those conversations, the financial concerns, the difference between the regulations of public versus private providers, education providers, as well as what was really interesting. One of the country representatives actually was sharing that they need to have an act of parliament that allows them to basically offer micro-credentials, and they were waiting on that to be able to move forward. So globally, we have quite a lot of different things happening. In looking at a Caribbean framework or a Caribbean micro-credential framework, we recognize that globally, this is something that everybody's grappling with, because we want to ensure that transferability, that portability for our learners, in addition to the quality of the micro-credential. And that report is, again, publicly available, so that information is accessible. So the definition that came out of an earlier meeting with the UNESCO group attempted to look at all of the definitions that have been coming out around micro-credentials for the last few years. So earlier this year, this report came out, and these were a couple of characteristics that they said define a micro-credential. So first of all, it's a record of small portions of learning. It could be digital, hybrid, or in person. It's variable duration. It could be formally accredited if the user so wishes. This is a really interesting one. I left it in there because it might bring up some discussion. This was kind of the only place I saw this piece. And of course, in the Caribbean, we will discuss whether or not it's if the user so wishes. But chances are that's not going to fly for us. But then what was important as well is the quality assurance recognized by both employers and institutions. You're looking at enhancing knowledge and or skills. This was a really important one. It's interesting that in some of the discussions we've been having around micro-credentials, there are persons who are framing micro-credentials as only being competency-based. So here's UNESCO looking across all of the different frameworks, all of the different discussions, all of the different reports and standards that are being set forward, and they're saying, listen, it could be knowledge, it could be skills. And then finally, it could be complementary to, meaning standalone, or it could actually be used to ladder or stack. And I know those are frames and terms that we are familiar with. And of course, we know that from a benefits perspective, it ought to enhance employability, support lifelong learning, and bridge skills gaps that we are seeing. Now, in terms of all of the frameworks that have come up until now, I pulled out a couple of common statements that are being made in standards, and I've laid them out here for you. So in terms of when we develop the standards, which is going to be a part of our framework that we develop, these are some of the things that we need to make sure each micro-credential has associated with it. So first of all, you make sure you stipulate your learning outcomes. Secondly, they must be mapped onto a national or a skills framework. And, you know, we have, in some cases, we have national qualifications frameworks. In other cases, we have skills frameworks. And I'm talking about the member states of the Caribbean now. The micro-credentials require an assessment. So sometimes we have this thing called a certificate of participation. A certificate of participation will not be a micro-credential because there's no assessment to issue a certificate of participation. And when you are designing a micro-credential, you need to stipulate the volume of learning. You have to have a minimum of a 1 hour learning. And generally, a micro-credential in terms of length is shorter than what our traditional qualifications lay out as certificates, diplomas, degrees, etc. Of course, they could be non-credit bearing. I'll have some thoughts about that a little later on. And they need to stipulate industry recognition where that is important. So obviously, if we have things like professional qualifications or professional bodies or professions where persons are supposed to have qualifications that map back onto council standards and so on, it should be clearly stated in the micro-credential which council is accepting this, what is the professional recognition that comes out of a micro-credential. And in cases where they do have credits, we need to make sure that they are explicit in the credits that they carry. So in terms of this robust framework, and that's the term that's used in part of the presentation, there are a few key areas that we need to look at. 3 key components. 1, quality assurance, and I know the room is, of course, right? Recognition is really important. So what it's pointing out here, it needs to be valued not only by educational institutions, we're putting out the product as you will, but the employers have to be, they have to recognize it, they have to be willing to accept it. And that speaks to who the stakeholders are who need to be involved in the development of these micro-credentials. Important, portability, facilitating cross-border recognition within the Caribbean. And I would dare say that when we develop our framework, what we need to do is also facilitate cross-border recognition globally as far as it is possible. And this, again, it's kind of the crux of why these frameworks are so important. Because if they can't speak to each other, if they can't relate to each other, we are putting our learners in a position of in a disadvantage. And again, I'll speak a little bit more of that later on. So of course, what's coming out of what we've looked at up until this point is there is a priority. We need to develop this regional consensus and definitions and standards around micro-credentials and around a micro-credential framework. So I'll just share with you quickly. I think a lot of people in the room may be aware of this. The CARICOM qualifications framework was, I believe it was approved in 2017. And in doing the work for the CARICOM qualifications framework, they did look at some other frameworks that were in existence. And here we have a graphic from the CARICOM report or the CARICOM document that looks at how its framework relates to what we call the transnational qualification framework and the European qualification framework. You'll see there's a bit of difference between the two, but there's an attempt to map one level onto the next. In terms of what's happening in the Caribbean, Jamaica has come out with their standards around 2017, their national qualifications framework around 2017. Trinidad and Tobago has come out with its qualifications framework in 2022. We have varying stages of, and Barbados in 2024, I believe. If I have any colleagues on from Barbados, my goodness, you guys are gatekeeping that framework layout. I have not been able to pull out a copy of it. But that came out in 2024. And of course, each of the countries here who have established frameworks are at varying levels or varying degrees of implementation as well. So the framework, remember the micro-credential has to map onto the framework. To what extent are we harmonized? To what extent are we mapping onto each other's frameworks? Because of course, that is going to be critical for that micro-credential to be accepted across the region. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the stakeholders who are involved in developing these frameworks and the stakeholders who are involved as far as how micro-credentials impact them, what their roles are and what the impacts are. I put the learners right up at the top because as I've been mentioning throughout, there's the greatest risk is to the learners themselves, to the students, to the persons who are accessing these micro-credentials. And the reason for that is what we find with the employers are pointing out to us, hey, listen, I need my people trained in this. I need them upskilled in that, et cetera, and they're approaching the education institutions, and they have been, and this is traditionally how we've been operating in the space. And that's why I said These are by no means new. The concept is not new. The employer is approaching us. We are going ahead and doing the training. Of course, we have our own internal mechanisms within the education providers groupings that allow us to develop something that has quality, that establishes learning outcomes, that tests these learning outcomes, etc. And guess what? Great, the employer is happy. You get me trained. But that learner, if that learner, for some reason, if a company shuts down, if something happens that doesn't allow them to continue to work in that particular organization, that time that they would have spent, yes, it's true that the employer would have invested in them, but the time they would have spent acquiring those skills, acquiring those competencies, acquiring the knowledge, can they take that and carry it anywhere else? And what are we as education providers doing in providing this training and also not ensuring it is something that can be transferable, it can be portable? So a lack of harmonization is leading to the greatest risk for our learners, a lack of standardized qualifications frameworks within the Caribbean, standardized micro-credentials frameworks within the Caribbean. The greatest risk is to our learners. Of course, the positive part of it to the learners is learners are allowed, if it's not necessarily industry specific, client requested, etc., it is an opportunity for us as well to allow learners to access education. Remember, we spoke about that access issue that came up earlier. Persons who would not traditionally be able to access longer range credentials, micro-credentials, is an opportunity for them to be able to access these longer range credentials. In terms of the education providers, interesting conversations that have been developing over the last 2 years or so. So in Trinidad and Tobago, sitting in a university, we might think of education providers, and I'm speaking specifically of post-secondary and tertiary level qualifications here. We think about TLIs and HEIs and the traditional institutions that offer post-secondary and tertiary level training. But we do have private institutions that have been operating in this space of continuing and professional development, that have been providing these training opportunities for persons. How do they fit into this framework? What are we saying to them now? Maybe they may have been operating up until now in a largely unregulated space. Now regulation is coming. There's an impact there for our, what I would call private providers or boutique providers, or just smaller firms that aren't established higher education institutions, aren't established tertiary level institutions. How is this going to impact them? And then as we think about education providers, we also have vendor-based training where we have organizations or certifying bodies who want to partner with higher education institutions to offer these micro-credentials. Again, it's not new. We've been doing it. How does a micro-credential framework, a regulated framework, a quality assured framework impact that? And then there's also an opportunity as well for course certification, where we are partnering with organizations who have technical skills, who have technical knowledge. We could partner with them to, again, service a need, fill a skills gap, and we could do course certification once they're involved in the design and the delivery of these micro-credentials. Another important stakeholder to think about is technology providers. Again, at these consultations, we find, especially the Latin America and the Caribbean consultations, there were technology providers there. So persons who are offering technology to allow us to do a multiplicity of things, not smallest of which issuing badges, issuing digital credentials, issuing verifiable credentials. They are, of course, offering technology to be able to track students STEM to STERN, to be able to help us with recruitment, etc. And there's a proliferation now. A lot of people are coming out with products and solutions to allow us to be able to issue certificates or certifications that are digital, that also allow for that portability, also allow for persons to be able to share information more freely and in a more valid way than just a certificate. How do we navigate that space? Who are these technology providers? How do we, as institutions who have to implement and issue these credentials, how do we make sure that those providers are providing a service that is robust, a service that is sustainable, etc., etc., etc.? That's a field that we need to start thinking through clearly. And then, of course, I didn't mean to group you all together, but you have the government, regulatory agencies, QA bodies. And what I would say here is what's critical for them in terms of their role is the agility around developing a framework, running us through a QA, saying this is what we need to be able to do as institutions in terms of quality assurance. Again, globally, you find that the relationship between higher education institutions and these quality assurance agencies or these regulatory bodies could be very cooperative. They could be very adversarial. I sat and I was listening to some of the discussions around financing micro-credentials. There's a significant cost associated with getting your micro-credentials quality assured, getting accreditation to be able to run micro-credentials, etc. The key here, I would say, for us in the Caribbean region is we need to think through agility. Micro-credentials are supposed to be very responsive. We're supposed to be able to be responsive to our employers, etc. And our QA system, our regulatory systems, allowing us to be able to develop and deliver a quality assure and deliver these credentials in a quick space of time. So those are some thoughts around the stakeholders who are all involved. I think I have a good bit of you all represented here. And again, we can discuss a little bit more about that. So in terms of challenges and considerations, first off the bat, a lack of awareness and understanding of micro-credentials. How are we doing with that? Well, if we don't have a framework, if we don't have standard definitions, it's kind of hard for us to go out there. And when I say us, I mean the collective us, the royal us, to go out there and put information out there that people will understand. One of the concerns would be the trust around micro-credentials, the trust around learners accessing them, the trust around employers accepting them. We, of course, have to think through resource constraints in developing and implementing micro-credential programs, both for the regulators as well as the education providers. This is something that is different, new, added to our regular administration, regular operations. There's a cost associated with it. How are we doing in terms of building frameworks and building plans and building maps around being able to deliver these micro-credentials in a way that allows us to assure the quality, but also service the needs of our learners and not put them into a space where they just kind of get bottlenecked. And of course, what's really important as well is making sure that these micro-credentials are aligned with national qualification frameworks. My question to the education providers in the room, if you think you know what a micro-credential is and you think you're offering it, have you aligned it with the national qualification framework of your country? What does that mean? Right? Some things to think about. In terms of implementation strategies, of course, in terms of when we've developed the micro-credential framework, we need to think through how we collaborate among the Caribbean nations in terms of developing it and then eventually implementing it. We obviously need to have everybody engaged as far as stakeholders to be able to design and then implement. We need to think about capacity building initiatives. A few people understand what's going on. Not everybody does, but more persons need to understand what the micro-credentials are, how they work, how we design them, how we quality assure them, etc. Something we could think about is whether we want to pilot and we want to look at some case studies and then do fuller implementation. So in terms of my last set of thoughts for you this evening, so I'm almost at the end. There were a couple of things that I came across as I have been preparing and in discussing with other colleagues. There are a couple of things that I thought of in terms of specific to the Caribbean context. There is a little bit of a heavier leaning towards understanding, accepting, and running ahead with more the TVET side of things versus higher education. So, I mean, I encapsulate, and I'm attempting to encapsulate everything that isn't TVET in higher education. There are qualifications frameworks that have existed for a long time, more on the TVET side of things. Where are the discussions? Are the discussions recognizing that we need to incorporate this higher education side, that we need to think about not just the skills, competency-based, technical sort of qualifications? Are we thinking about the higher education side of things, how we design those micro-credentials? Are the frameworks designed and are they, do they have room to incorporate higher education, the higher education side of things? Something to think about. Then in terms of our shift, in terms of transformation is talking about us transforming the way we operate. Certification versus verifiable credentials. So something that's typical, something we all understand is certification. Getting something that says, I have done, I've completed some course of study in X discipline, etc., etc. The idea around verifiable credentials is obviously digital. When I was talking about the technology providers, this is one of the benefits where you not only share a certificate that has a title and what level of award you would have gotten, but the verifiable credentials goes even further to indicate what the learning outcomes are or the competencies are that have been acquired through the particular credential. This is where the technology is really important. It's what's happening globally with micro-credentials. It's something that we need to move into. So again, while we recognize that certification is our traditional frame, how do we now shift to the verifiable credentials frame? How do we incorporate it? And of course, how do we secure it? Then the concept of credit versus non-credit. So I would say in more of our more traditional, older higher education institutions, we think of academic credit, and then other things are not for credit. We have different learning units that we use, like continuing education units, et cetera, et cetera. I think the point I want to bring out here is, how do we ensure that there isn't the word that's coming to mind, I shouldn't say, I was going to say bastardizing, but we want to ensure that when micro-credentials and the responsiveness to the industry and so on, and we're developing these micro-credentials, we're developing these offerings, chances are they fall into the not credit category, although you can say what the volume of learning is, the number of hours, etc., and those are industry accepted standards. How do we ensure that as we move from what we've been doing traditionally into something that is new in terms of how we are framing the micro-credentials? How do we ensure that the not credit offerings are not seen in some way, shape, or form as less than, less quality, less rigor, etc.? Because in truth and in fact, in us developing these micro-credential frameworks, the whole point is that we are assuring the quality and the rigor of these offerings that may not be for credit. And the last point I want to make for you all this evening is the operating environment. So one of the things where we're thinking about doing a renovation, forgive me if you heard my analogy for those of you who've been in meetings with me before, but one of the analogies I wanted to use was the difference between having a fine dining restaurant, which is what some of the education providers are accustomed to doing or having when it comes to our long-range traditional credentials and programs, to moving to something that might be more of a deli style situation when it comes to the micro-credentials. And the consideration around that is, have we thought through everything that is impacted and everything that changes when we move from a long-range credential to a shorter credential, and what that means and how we service our customers, how we service our students, the difference in the systems that we have to set up, the fact that we have to incorporate more the use of technology in sometimes the administration around these courses, how our institutional policies are designed and developed. Are we just tacking something on, or are we understanding that a true transformation has to take place within not only the education institutions, but with our regulatory bodies and obviously with the government, the governments as well, and what they accept and what they support, etc., and recognizing that even in, let's say, institutions that have support from governments or get sponsored and funded by governments, are they recognizing that this is now going to be part, parcel, and a core part of our business as higher education institutions, and therefore recognize that resources have to be allocated to that. So it's about thinking through everything related to offering a micro-credential to a learner. Are we transforming our process? Are we transforming our system? Are we transforming our administration? And even in the delivery of these micro-credentials, there's a different way that we may have to deliver. It's shorter form. Our facilitators need to be dynamic to be able to bring the information across. It's more practical based, etc., etc. Do we even think about the persons who are offering it? Are persons more suited to the longer range credentials, the longer classes, etc., in terms of their skills and or can they deliver micro-credentials? So all of those things are things we have to think through in various organizations that we sit in. So I hope I have demystified a few things, and I hope I have given you some food for thought. And I thank you very much for your attention, and please feel free if you have any questions for me.
Oh, wow. Thank you so very much, Tennille. Did I say she was dynamic? That has been a really good presentation. Lots of gems, lots of food for thought. You know, I hear, how do we ensure quality? How are our regulator framework agile? The learner is at risk. Lots of information to really process and go through. So I thank you very much. At this time, we'll have a question and answer. You can use the raise hand feature, or you can drop your questions in the chat. So I'm not seeing any raised hands. Let me look in the chat. Okay, so
Much to consider.
yeah, much to consider.
A lot of consultation, yes, that is true.
Yeah.
A lot of consultation is required.
That's a lot to unpack. Yeah.
And again, as one of the things, I mean, I just want to reiterate, I see Monique's hands is up. She can go ahead and ask.
Hi, good evening to all. Can you hear me?
Yes, good evening.
Okay, awesome. Well, one of the things I think we need to also work on, at a tertiary level, is the understanding, because we are so rooted in this credit modality, that when it comes to micro-credentialing, we're still fighting with that transition. And that lack of agility is actually holding us back, because we feel comfortable with the traditional structure. And that move to micro-credentialing is something which, in our environment, I can speak based on actually from South Africa's Community College. We tend to be very hesitant in terms of embracing the whole concept of micro-credentialing, because we still want to try and fit in the whole traditional credited module and try and get it to fit in to this micro-credentialing, and it doesn't work that way. Thank you.
Thanks, and if I may respond, I mean, you also bring out something that's very important for us to recognize as we move in terms of developing. You made a point about credits, but there's an underlying point that's really important. All of the Caribbean territories, all of the Caribbean countries don't all have the same cultural setup. We don't all have the same approach in terms of, if you want to call it maturity, if you want to call it knowledge, acceptance, understanding of even the traditional systems. So we are not dealing with a homogeneous group of people. And again, the conversation with the other group in the Latin American group, they are also grappling. There are some of those that are pretty downstream. They're very advanced. They understand things clearly. And there are other territories, other countries that are grappling with some very, very, very fundamental questions. So as we move through developing this framework, and all of you who will be participating in it as we move forward, that's a really critical point. I see my colleague Jamie's on. I don't know if she wants to expand more on that. Jamie, go ahead.
Hi, Tanya. Good evening. First of all, I just want to say that your presentation was excellent, and I am so excited to be able to be in the room and to have you share all of this, because, you know, behind the scenes, Tanya and I, we've had copious conversations about micro-credentials, not only in the region, what's happening globally, and how we can even continue to support and push forward the concept and throughout the Caribbean at the UAE. um, I really agree with I think Monique is her name, colleague that spoke earlier, because you are right in saying that there's a lot of demystifying and smoke and mirrors and all of these things that are around micro-credentialing. And I even wanted to expand further because when you started your presentation, you asked about the two pictures. And I absolutely believe that it's the left because of a couple things. One, in the region, we approach a lot of things from the perspective of ownership. How do we own this thing as a region? Not just our higher education institutions, not just our employers, our governments, even our students. How are we doing that? And while there are lots of frameworks and established theories and approaches to micro-credentials globally, how do we make it our own? And the reason why we need to make it our own is because we need that buy-in from our students, from our educators, from our employers. And then there's a third part of that, a third prong of it, where a lot of the conversations don't include students at all. And they are the biggest stakeholders of micro-credentials. What do they want? What are they looking towards? I hear you talking about, UNESCO not considering, and this is also not just UNESCO globally, certificates of participation, not a micro-credential, but you have the learners who are willing to just sit in a session, soak up some information to just take home. They don't necessarily need credits for it. They don't need accolades for it. They just want to know that they have something to show they've participated in some kind of learning. So like the person in the chat saying, it's a lot of re-education, recalibration of what we consider and redefining what it means for us here in the region. So I think just to put a button on what my contribution and just to ask a question to you and to the room also, how do we create a space in the region where we can own it? Because while we are autonomous countries, Belize, but I know Jamaica has not just an NQF, but they also have their national framework for micro-credentials that they developed a couple of years ago. I know that that's happening in Trinidad. I know there's initiatives coming out of CARICOM, but how do we ensure we're doing it collectively and still maintain that level of autonomy that helps to foster buy-in from the local governments, from the local institutions, from local students, and still do justice to fitting into that piece of the puzzle globally? It's a lot. I see that in the chat. It's a very big undertaking, but how do we do that? I think that's the bigger big picture question.
One of the things that I had put a note to mention, and I just wanted to move through the presentation quickly. Interestingly enough, when you look at the New Zealand's framework, there is very upfront, one of the main or core objectives of their framework is to incorporate the Maori peoples, their ways of educating, and incorporating that indigenous group into the formal framework of the country. And I thought, and again, there's so much that you want to share, but you just kind of have to hone it down and narrow it down for the room. But one of the things I thought of in terms of relating something back, that ownership and so on, is how are we unique as a region? What are the things that, that servicing, that access and so on that I was talking about as well? What about our indigenous peoples? How are they different from traditional learners? How do we make sure there's space and we incorporate them? So that point about the learners being part of the collaboration and the consultation and the framework, how do we incorporate them in what we design and what we develop to make sure that even what we design and we develop is inclusive and we don't just simply take somebody else's framework, adopt it and run with it? And I thought that it was such a refreshing thing to see that New Zealand had incorporated this group, incorporated their traditional methods and so on into their qualifications framework. And in fact, it was a space to be able to incorporate that type of system into the formal part of it. It might have been much more difficult to incorporate them into the longer range credentials. So I will say that about the cultural part as well. Your question is exactly the point. Your question is exactly the issue that, regardless of all of the information we have at our fingertips, is the crux of the problem or the crux of the issue that we have to solve. I won't attempt to give an answer other than to say there are other things we've tried to do as a region. There are other initiatives, there are other frameworks, there are other projects that we've tried to engage in as a region. Which are the ones that have worked and why? What are the characteristics of that? And I would say one of the things I would dare to even state in that, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form experienced or expert in that area. But one of the things I think is really critical, and Jamie, in terms of the work we've done with UWI and trying to get the UWI harmonized across of all of our territories, is to take a softer approach and not necessarily take a top-down approach. More education, more trust, building more trust, and getting persons at a lower level, not a lower level, but at the ground level, excuse me, more involved in the design, the development, the administration, the consultation, so that by the time an actual framework comes out, we are all already participating, we all already agree. That might be a bit idealistic, but it'll be the only piece of information I would offer other than to say we need to look at what's happening or what has happened in our past, what are the things that have worked and why, and what are the things that haven't worked and why. There's particularly interested, Lisette is talking about risk to students. How are we mitigating this risk, not only within our individual islands, but within the Caribbean and the world? Right. So part of it is unified frameworks. Part of it is making sure that we pay attention not only internally to what is happening, but we also have an outward-looking focus that marries those two things. The how needs to be based on collaboration, agreed, incorporating with our cultural innuendos, educational framework, structure, students, and workspace. Yeah, unique. So I see that's a question.
Yeah, there's a hand up, Barbara.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much for the presentation. I was particularly interested in it because I oversee the Professional Development Institute, my university, and I'm glad that Mr. Floyd there of ACTT is there. Let me mention three things. First, the presenter asked, what have we done very well as a region? Well, I have my four favorite things that I always quote. CARIFESTA, CXC, Cricket, and CARICOM. And to that, I would add CAM-HP because I'm always impressed by CAM-HP. It's functioning and it is well regarded. But let me make that bridge to what I really wanted to say. I think what CAM-HP has done for our medical programs, whether it's the MBBS or whatever else it's spawning now, is that it adds value. And that, I think, is the missing link in the discourse and the dialogue and the discussion around micro-credentialing and short courses. And that is that our stakeholders need to see the added value of whatever we do to their lives. And thank you very much. You've explained beautifully about the why, the demand factors. My biggest challenge is how quickly will our accreditation councils adapt to ensure that micro-credentials, short courses, executive courses are, it's an awkward verb that we use, but I'm going to use it anyhow, quality assured. And we really shouldn't be talking about quality assured as a verb. But anyway, it's the 21st century. How quickly and how effectively can this be done without being burdensome? Now, from farm to table, in terms of a typical undergraduate degree, and this is the second university in which I'm doing this, it was like 22 months. You can't do that for a short course. Not in this business environment. And I usually say to my colleagues, a university is the academy, yes, but it's also a business. So that's not going to work. And therefore, having sat on the board of 2 accreditation councils, I'm very interested in how accreditation councils adapt, not to compromise what has been done or continues to be done in the academic division, but in the provision of professional development, short courses, whatever else we want to call them, micro-credentials, badges. How are our accreditation councils adapting? And or should this be the mechanism for quality assuring short courses, or should there be an alternative mechanism for doing this? So it's a query, a rhetorical question, but also it's a query for reflection. And I do thank you again for organizing this. And Madam Presenter, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sorry I'm hoarse.
And yes, it is rhetorical. And yes, this is absolutely the room to be asking that question in. And I hope our members of CANQATE here is, it's something that is going to be on the agenda and they're in show and ashore. And just to say, yes, that those are exactly the questions to what Jamie has asked earlier. Those are exactly the questions that are burning questions that are asked. And again, how are we transforming? How are we looking at how are we flipping this on its head? How are we thinking outside of its box? Jamie and I have an old colleague who would have said you have to unhinge your mind when you're dealing with micro-credentials. So how do we do that? How do we make that shift? Absolutely. And of course, here we go.
Yes, I know that's you're just cajoling me to jump in here and make some sort of comment right now. Again, to Neil, I just want to endorse what was said previously by some of the other participants. Good presentation, very thought-provoking, and lots of what you would have said and what, Dr. Reynolds would have just mentioned, having sat on the ACTT council. It is something, yes, I agree that the accreditation bodies regionally, the quality assurance agencies need to take into consideration. And maybe all of this could lead into probably a panel discussion later on surrounding this whole topic with micro-credentials and with qualifications, frameworks, etc. And keeping particularly in mind the burning question or statement that you would have made in terms of how is this impacting the stakeholders, the learners, without putting them at any disadvantage. As you would have indicated, and we would have been exposed to, there is no one common definition of what a micro-credential is. Different parts of the world, in Australia, in Africa, in the US, there are different definitions of what a micro-credential is. And I think that there is variety based on cultural context, etc. And while we would want to be able to have the quality assurance agencies regionally come up with some framework or mechanism for quality assuring, forgive me, Dr. Reynolds, quality assuring micro-credentials. We also have to keep in mind that each territory may want to develop a framework that is suited to their particular context, but we also have to think about what you would have mentioned in your presentation in terms of the portability and acceptability of whatever you are quality assuring in your particular country. You want to ensure that that is accepted throughout the region and internationally. So yes, while we want to have a quick response, we also have to take into consideration that you want the quality assurance of this micro-credential to be accepted internationally, because we all know while we have learners being educated here, they seek jobs elsewhere. Right, and that is one of the salient considerations, I think, in moving forward. So likewise, we would have encountered with qualifications frameworks. Each country in the Caribbean want to develop their own qualification framework. Then there is CARICOM that is pushing their agenda. And then there is CAL pushing their agenda, so there needs to be some sort of collaboration and corroboration in terms of how we are approaching this. But yes, it is something which is very, very prevalent, and we are being approached all the time by providers asking, when are we going to get on board? Everybody wants to be the first one to have their micro-credentials quality assured. Yeah, but it is the way of the world, and it is something that we will all have to collaborate on a unified way forward.
And may I ask a question just quickly? Because it's a point that came up in another conversation I was having, another meeting I was having. Are you recognizing that there are institutions that are going to be approaching you who you do not have a relationship with now? Some persons are going to be coming out of the woodworks now with this whole micro-credential thrust?
And we are fully cognizant of that. Yes, we are fully cognizant of that. And I think that more so, those are the ones who would need to be regulated over those whom we currently have a relationship with and who understand what our expectations are as a quality assurance body from those providers. So yes, all of those are the ones who we'll have to be targeting.
So I mean, population-wise and so on, we're a lot smaller. And just to wrap up what you're saying there as well, one of the things that came up, one of the conversations that came up is, how do we regulate those private providers? And the regulation of the private providers is connected to the acceptance of the employers and the learners of still pursuing those opportunities in spite of the fact that they may not be accredited. Let's call it that way. And that question came up, and the answer to the question is we really don't know what's going to happen. There's a possibility, depending on how we do our education, depending on how inflexible we might be appearing to be when we do develop our frameworks and go through the process of accreditation, that if there are these private providers and employers are still approaching them, learners are still going to them, you may still even have that gap of a lack of regulation. That's another risk that we have as well. And that was something that the larger countries are grappling with, because as you could appreciate, they have much larger populations, and their populations are split between what they call the public and the private providers. Public providers being those that are regulated, and the private ones being those other types of institutions that don't have a requirement to be regulated. So there's also that element that we have to consider now that we're expanding into this area of micro-credentials, where you have these private providers who are operating in all of our territories right now, who up until this point have not had to be regulated. So how do we even convince them? And then how do we convince the employers that, hey, you should come to a UE, or you should come to a Costa, or you should come to Jamaica, forgive me, your college is not coming to my head, Jamaica Technology University. How do you convince them come to you versus these private providers who are unregulated, right? I mean, it's a question to be asked.
It's a question, yes, but just very quickly, not wanting to dominate or prolong, there is the point that was made earlier on in terms of the benefit, not only to the learner, but also to the institution, and how are we going to engage them and encourage them to come forward and have their qualifications quality assured. And I can relate it to even what we do at ECTT here, and with the quality assurance of the institutions themselves through registration and accreditation. There are lots of providers who would want to have that stamp of approval by the quality assurance body, because it gives some sort of status and value to their institution and to their offerings. And likewise, I mean, we are all outside here competing. And likewise with the micro-credentials, I think that once the quality assurance mechanism is in place and up and running, I think that those persons out there who currently don't have a relationship with ECTT would want to have that stamp of approval by the quality assurance agency, which will help with the promotion of their qualifications and engaging persons to come and be a part of their offering. And I think a lot of it will have to do too with regards to policy and regulation, because you would have mentioned in your presentation that the quality assurance of these micro-credentials is also dependent on if the persons choose to have them quality assured. And again, based on what you mentioned, yes, based on what I would have mentioned with regard to the competition and to getting that stamp of approval, I think that with public education, we wouldn't have an issue there. I don't anticipate an issue there.
Well, there's a question in the chat, and I suppose that that's for you as well, Curtis. Is there a central role that CANQATE can play, that convening role?
I would have mentioned in one of my earlier discourse that we have at CANQATE, of course, we have different regions represented here throughout the Caribbean. And in each of these territories, they are looking at developing their own frameworks and developing their own definition and framework of what micro-credential is and how that is linking to their qualification framework. And when we want to consider the portability, I think that we would have to work together as a region to come to some common understanding, not only in terms of what we would consider a micro-credential and acceptability of the quality assurance that would be given by the respective quality assurance bodies in the territory. And as I said, you know, I think that this would be a good stepping stone for us to probably engage further in this discussion through a panel discussion before we have our conference, or maybe even during the conference.
Right. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other hand or question in the chat. I'm telling you, I want to go back to something you said about especially higher education institutions that they're into formal basic, and I'm paraphrasing, they're into formal education. So the micro-credentials, the people who deliver those programs probably would need training and how to deliver micro-credentials as opposed to a formal, like a bachelor's degree and so on. How do you see that training taking place?
I didn't necessarily come to the conclusion that there was training that was needed. I think the point I was making is acknowledging or recognizing that in terms of your resources, right, as an institution, again, a lot of us have been offering professional development in some form or fashion and to some extent. But if we start to go down this route, there is a difference that comes with the effectiveness around delivering a shorter, smaller learning opportunity. And it is not to be taken for granted. I think this is the point I was making. It's not to be taken for granted that someone who is traditionally sits in a classroom where they lecture to students across 13 weeks for them to be able to acquire and develop the skills and the competencies is always prepared or has the skill set to be able to deliver the shorter forms of these a micro-credential. So it's just putting it out there. I would say, of course, training may be one of the responses or one of the solutions, but it is just about bringing to people's minds that in terms of when you're looking at your resources and you're making that pivot and you're making that shift as an institution, recognize that, again, part of your service delivery, part of the effectiveness of your delivery is going to be related to the person who is doing the delivery. And there are persons who do it better. There are persons who this is their bread and butter and they understand how to relate to students in that environment, in that type of environment in terms of a shorter engagement. And one of the things that we have to consider if and when we are getting into the playing fields of micro-credentials is that element of that, even the delivery part of it. Can we do it? Are we doing it well? What do we need to make sure that we put in place to be able to do it well? Because you could also lose people through that. And I would say from the UWI perspective, there is a significant amount of this business, if we want to call it, that comes to us directly from our employers. And if our employers are not satisfied with the product that institution A is giving, they will go to institution B. Right? So it's about that recognition that it isn't automatic, that someone who is accustomed to the traditional form of delivery is also going to be suited to the new form of delivery that we would want to engage in.
All right, thank you so much for that. I'm not seeing any further questions in the chat. So let me thank you once again. We have really had a rich discussion, a rich engagement, lots of wealth of information. And so we thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, as we bring this insightful webinar to a close. I really want to extend sincere thanks to our participants for joining us today, and for your thoughtful questions and engagement throughout the session. I want to thank again our presenter, Ms. Tanil Panovich, for sharing her expertise and really sparking some important conversations. Thanks to Dr. Palmer for the update on the conference, and to our president for bringing the warm welcome. At CANQATE, we remain committed to advancing quality in education across the region. And so these kinds of discussions help us to not just for information, but help us to stay connected and really stay informed. As I say, we look forward to Conference 2025 in Belize. So let us continue to build on today's discussion and really explore new opportunities together. And again, see you in Belize. So thanks everyone, and have a very good evening.